Hello, everyone, and welcome back to History's Agenda. Tonight, we're going to get back into something that we've talked about briefly, and it's been a subject of some of our videos and will be again, and that is the assassination game that seems to go on in America and around the world about changing the course of history through assassinations. And tonight, we're going to talk about probably the one that had the most effect on myself in December of 1980 when I was coming home from watching the football game and the last few minutes on when New England was going to kick a field goal or try to kick a field goal, and at my parents' house with my mom and dad sitting in their chair, and Howard Cosell goes and says, "Could this be true? John Lennon has been shot," and he was DOA to the hospital. Quite a shocking event. And of course, we have with us again, Dom. How are you, Dom?
I'm doing well, Judge. Thank you.
Dom is an expert in this field. He spends a lot of time researching these things, as he does with a lot of assassinations, and we're lucky to have him with us. One of the other things of that night that I remember is that I didn't believe the broadcast. I went into my bedroom. I turned on WNEW at the time, which was the big time radio station. And when I heard they were playing the Double Fantasy album, I knew it was true.
Yeah.
I don't know what you remember from that night, though.
Actually, nothing, because I was sleeping. I was in 12th grade and I wasn't watching Monday Night Football. So the next morning, my mother woke me up and, she shook me out of bed and said John Lennon was killed last night. That's how I found out.
Right.
It was a tough year for us in 12th grade. We lost John Bonham in September and John Lennon in December.
Right.
Yeah.
So what was John Belushi that year too?
No, I think he was March 82 or 83.
Much later. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
I knew it was around the same time period, but whatever. But those obviously weren't assassinations. John Bonham, I believe, was a drug overdose or something like that, or a cardiac arrest from those kind of things. But
Alcohol, I think.
alcohol, yeah. John Lennon is an amazing story, and you think it's not related or not an assassination that would be politically driven, as when we talk about Medgar Evers, when we talk about MLK, RFK, JFK. But in hindsight, and later it is, there are a lot of political motivations here.
Yeah, without question. No doubt. John was on people's radar since the 1960s. When the Beatles hit it big, gigantic in 1964 with Beatlemania, they captivated the West. And in Soviet Union and their satellite states, their music was banned. And there were very serious penalties for kids who got caught with the Beatles record. You would be stopped from going to school, from college and finishing school. So your future was very limited, but they had a massive business in Beatles bootlegs, and it was very big. Their influence was such that the KGB actually considered them a weapon of war. And they, believe it or not, they spied on them. And what they did was in the 60s, it was illegal to be gay in Great Britain. And the Beatles manager, Brian Epstein, was gay, but it wasn't known at that time. And with the KGB spying on them, they found out about it, and they put together a short film that they showed to Soviet youth talking about the decadence of the West. But what would happen is broadcasts from high-powered radio stations would be received in Russia, and some kids had tape recorders, and they would tape record Beatles songs. And they developed this ingenious way of making records. It seems that in the Soviet Union, they used to have these booths that were typically used by soldiers to create an album to send home to their parents. And what these kids would do is they would play the recording that they made, onto an X-ray that they would steal from hospitals that were discarded. And that would
Amazing.
become Yeah, that would become their record, and then they would mass produce that. And what was interesting was with the X-rays, they would walk out and, you could bend it over your arm or your leg, and it wouldn't be seen because there would be policemen there, looking and checking, but they wouldn't see it because you could bend it, and it became a huge business. So the Beatles had massive influence in the Soviet Union to such a degree that later on, people like Mikhail Gorbachev talked about their influence. And I actually have some quotes from him. And it says that Mikhail Gorbachev famously credited the Beatles with having a more significant impact on the end of the Cold War than traditional political or military measures. Said on the Cold War, he stated, quote, more than any ideology, more than any religion, more than Vietnam or any other war or nuclear bomb, the single most important reason for the diffusion of the Cold War was the Beatles. Think about that. And during a private meeting with Paul McCartney in 1993, Gorbachev told him, I do believe that the music of the Beatles taught young people of the Soviet Union that there is another life. On the fall of communism, he suggested that the band's music helped break down the unshakable dogmas of the Soviet era by making Western culture appear human and non-threatening to Soviet youth. And at the time, the Soviet Union fell apart in 91, and in 93, uh, Putin, excuse me, Paul McCartney, you have to edit that. Paul McCartney did a concert in Red Square. Putin said he attended the concert, and he said that the Beatles' work was a drop of freedom that helped humanize the West for young Russians, despite the era's heavy over-idealization. And there's another important statement by a Dr. Yuri Pelyashin. I'm not good with Russian words, but he said the Beatles had a tremendous impact on Soviet kids. The Soviet authorities thought of the Beatles as a secret Cold War weapon. The kids lost their interest in all Soviet unshakable dogmas and ideas and stopped thinking of an English-speaking person as the enemy. That's when the communists lost 2 generations of young people. That was an incredible impact. And all this stuff about the Beatles' influence on bringing down, communism and helping end the Cold War is chronicled in the book How the Beatles Rocked the Kremlin by Leslie Woodhead, who was a journalist, a filmmaker, and was a spy for England.
Hmm.
So that shows you, the influence that they had and the power to introduce ideas into millions of people. And certainly the intellectual force behind them was John Lennon.
So I'm surprised the Soviets let him in to do a concert.
Well, by then, the Soviet Union had fallen and things changed. And what happened was, there's actually a documentary on that concert, Paul's concert in Red Square. And one of Putin's early top dogs talks about how basically, the Soviet youth in the 60s, by the late 80s, early 90s, when the Soviet Union was falling apart, they had partaken. Now they were part of that system. They entered into that life, and because they were denied things from the West, they wanted to end that system.
Huh.
So that's how that all went down. And Paul was like a perfect person to exemplify that.
Just goes to shows the effect on the Soviet Union. Now, you can only imagine that the effect on American people. I mean, I know when John came out and said we're more popular than Jesus Christ, I know what effect that had,
Right.
negative effect. Um, and I
Right.
don't think, I think there's a considerable part of the right wing community that never forgot that.
Oh, without question. I mean, if you look at the USA versus John Lennon, which is a phenomenal documentary, you see this Ku Klux Klan guy in the '60s talking about how they were gonna stop the Beatles, performing in the South and all that. But one of the things that they did prior to all of the stuff that happened after he made the comment about Jesus, which is taken kind of out of context.
Yeah, I thought totally out of context.
He was talking to a friend who was a writer in England for a magazine, and it took about 2 months for it to come over here, and they kinda took things out of context. He was comparing the Beatles' popularity with Jesus in England and what they meant to kids in England. But as he says, it wasn't saying that we were better, which I'm just saying that we were more popular, which is probably accurate?
With kids at that time, they were incredibly popular, and kids weren't coming home and they were putting on records. They weren't like grabbing onto their Bible.
Yeah, and at that time, uh, the Beatles kind of geared their audience to young girls, basically.
Yeah.
So that was their big concert going audience. So, you know, but one of the things that they did, and they're not given any credit for this, but when they started touring in the United States, when they found out about segregation, they told the Southern promoters that under no circumstances are they ever going to play any venue where black people can't sit wherever they want to sit.
Right.
Lo and behold, segregation ended in those venues when the Beatles played. So that's another example of their power that they had. Not too many people were able to do that. The only other one that I know of, and he's not given any credit for it either, and in some ways it's more impressive, but Frank Sinatra said that he will not play in any hotel in Las Vegas that does not allow Sammy Davis Jr. to stay there. And given who actually owned the hotels, that was quite a statement on his part. But that's unfortunate. They're not given credit for that. They should be.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of things they're not given credit for. I mean, other than the amazing writing, that I still think people don't credit Ringo's ability as a drummer because he wasn't all over the place like other people. But if you speak to a lot of famous drummers, Dave Grohl, on
Right.
and on and on, and Dave Grohl could be one of the best drummers I ever saw, and I saw a lot. He says Ringo's the best, and everyone does. He was just different. So that, and George had a different way about him too. He was very peace oriented. It's not really given that much credit. Peace and love,
Right.
and religious as John is, because John's more outspoken. I was thinking about the day that Lennon was shot, and he had done a photo shoot with Ann Leibovitz
Mhm.
that day, and where he wanted both him and Yoko, where she wanted him and Yoko to be naked on the cover of Rolling Stone, and Yoko had said she'd be topless, and then went back and forth. She ended up being fully clothed, and John was totally naked, which came out because the assassination came out in January. Uh, there was a little bit of a delay for that, and he had been recording that day putting the finished touches on one of Yoko's songs. Now, he also spent some time signing autographs earlier in the day outside of 4 or 5 or 6 hours after his death. I think 5 hours he was signing some autographs, and he signed an autograph for the gentleman who is accused of being his assassin.
Yep. Yeah, and it's famously captured in a photograph.
Right.
So, yeah, John signed this Double Fantasy album, which came out in November, and he signed it for Mark David Chapman. And then he said, "Is that all you want?" And Chapman said, "Yes." And John went off to the
Yeah.
recording studio.
Is there anything else you like, or anything else, something like that?
Yeah.
And you say to yourself that, you know, apparently, um, since we're talking about this a minute, apparently he came to New York before, and and with the purpose, and changed his mind and went home back to his wife,
Yeah,
who was aware that he was looking to do this. I mean, she obviously tells a different story of the day,
right.
but she definitely was aware that he wanted to kill John Lennon to make himself famous.
One of the things that I find very odd about Mark David Chapman is it seems like he has a lot of money because he does a lot of traveling and he also has a painting collection. And the guy was a security guard in a hospital. I just find that kind of weird. You know, he took a trip and he lived in Hawaii. So, you know, it's expensive to fly from Hawaii to the United States to start out with. And this is before deregulation. So it was really expensive in the
It was
70s to make
really
that,
expensive.
you know. Um, for the hell of it, I Googled it today, how much was a ticket from Hawaii to Chicago, because that was one of the locations he went to. And they said it was from 400 to $700 back in 1980. So, you know, that's what, it's around 2 grand today, give or
Right.
take. So,
I
yeah,
remember I believe I flew to Hawaii in 1980, actually 1979, because it was the anniversary. The reason I remember the year is because it was the anniversary of statehood for
mhm,
Hawaii. And I remember
right,
it was really expensive that I had to
right,
save my money to do it. Um, you know, another little tidbit that I find really interesting, that on that day, Chapman, I believe it was that day, runs into in the train station James
right.
Taylor.
So that was, I believe, the day before.
Day
And
before?
yeah, and it's interesting. There's a whole dialogue about the potential for 2 Mark Chapmans who have been out there, you know, 2 lookalikes, because there's this guy, Ed Opperman, who was a private eye. Now he does podcasts out of, I think, Las Vegas. And he was hanging out at the Yippee place. The Yippies were a political party back then.
Right.
It was on Bleecker Street, Bleecker by the Bowery. And there's a Mark David Chapman hanging out, like, I think it was Friday or Saturday before the assassination. And it was he was completely unlike the Mark David Chapman that was hanging out all day by the Dakota. The Dakota Mark David Chapman was very calm. As a matter of fact, 2 of the, people, uh, people have to understand that people hung out. It was very common for people to hang out all day long in front of the Dakota with the hope of getting a glimpse of John Lennon. That happened
Sure.
every day, every day. So the Dakota Mark David Chapman was hanging out, and he actually went to lunch with 2 girls that were hanging out. They said he was fine. He was totally normal. But Opperman says he behaved really strange at the Yippee place. There was a cab driver who gave him a ride to Greenwich Village, which, that's where the Yippee, he probably brought him to the Yippee place. He said he was like, felt he was on drugs or something, like really, really wired. And then you have the James Taylor, running into Mark David Chapman. What's interesting is the author of this book, which plug his book, Mind Games: The Assassination of John Lennon by David Whelan. He spoke to the cab driver. Yeah, once he found out about the cab driver, he contacted either he or Opperman contacted Mark David Chapman's attorney, and this is years later. And they said, do you have any recollection of being in this guy's cab? And Chapman said, no, I don't remember that at all. Yeah, I didn't take a cab drive. So it's kind of weird.
That's just part of it, right? That's
It's
part of the
almost like,
weirdness of it all.
like the 2 Oswalds, There might have been 2 Chapmans out there that day as well.
Well, it's funny, the relationship between these kinds of assassins, and he did have the book with him that day,
Yeah,
um, The Catcher in the Rye, and I believe
yeah,
he inscribed it to say, I think he inscribed it, uh, to Holden Caulfield from Holden Caulfield.
right. Right. Yeah, what happened was after the shooting occurred, instead of I've been to the Dakota, and all he had to do was leave the driveway and make a left, and like a few hundred feet, you have the subway.
Yeah.
And across the street is Central Park. So instead of trying to escape, Mark David Chapman did a very unusual thing. He went underneath a street light and he took out the Catcher in the Rye that he was holding and he started reading it. So I don't know. And the Catcher in the Rye comes into play 3.5 months later with the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, because when they go through John Hinckley's apartment, lo and behold, what book do they find? The Catcher in the Rye.
Right.
So a lot of people that follow the idea of a Manchurian Candidate through MK Ultra think that somehow the Catcher in the Rye was used as a trigger for both of them.
Interesting.
Yeah,
So, I mean, we hear those stories of triggers and RFK. We hear
right,
those stories of assassination. You know, the woman on the back steps with the, what was her dress? Polka dot dress. And when you think of the movie Manchurian Candidate, and I'm thinking about the original one with Frank Sinatra.
right.
I mean, it was it the Queen of Hearts?
Yes.
The Queen of Hearts was a card that was that clicked that programmed episode in his body. So that's certainly interesting, but there's so much more interesting. I don't know where you want to start with looking in. I mean, is there's also this HBO documentary that was multi-parts, and Dom and I both watched it together. And it, I believe, was called Murder Without Investigation
Yeah,
or
something like
something
that.
like
Something
that.
like that. Yeah.
And I urge everyone to watch it. It's interesting. So Chapman's there. He's waiting for John Lennon. Um, and there are witnesses. And
Yeah.
there's not one story that matches the official story.
Right.
Um, I don't know where you want to start. It's up to you.
Okay. So John left the recording studio and arrived at the Dakota sometime around 10:30 or so, 10:15, 10:30,
Right.
something like that. He and Yoko get out of the limousine. They must have passed Mark David Chapman, who was kind of like on the sidewalk by the driveway. And according to Mark David Chapman's testimony, he felt compelled to shoot John Lennon. So he pulls out his pistol, which I think held 5 rounds, and he fired it. He went to a combat stance and he fired it. So we are told that that's how John Lennon died, that he was shot in the back by Mark David Chapman. The problem is that David Whelan comes along and he interviews the doctor who tried to save John's life and the two attending nurses that night, and all three of them have a different story. They all say that John was shot 4 times, tight grouping, right above the heart, had to die instantly. We have what's also strange is there's a pool of blood in the driveway of the Dakota that's cleaned up the next day, but people see it. People who live there saw it and
Right.
they saw the cleanup. John was not found in the driveway. John was, it seems, brought inside the Dakota and put into the back office of the concierge, or however you say that. His
I
Yeah,
say it weird too.
yeah. So that's where the police found him face down. Now, the doctor says that John's death had to be instantaneous. It was a very professional job. Anybody who shoots pistols knows that you have to be really, really good to get a tight grouping, especially while you're shooting quickly, because, the gun has a kick to it. But one of the police officers talks about having like a little bit of a discussion with John. And, the doctor said that's impossible. He was gone. So that's what you have. You have two stories that are in conflict with each other. The accepted version that was put out to the public was that Mark David Chapman became obsessed with John Lennon, started signing John Lennon's name for as his own at the hospital, and came to New York and killed him. And then you have this other idea that maybe Chapman was an MK Ultra assassin and that there was a real assassin waiting for John. Now, one of the things I encourage people to go to David Whelan's Substack and join it, support him because he writes in every now and then. And what he talks about is recently that he found people that were living in the Dakota. And the 2 days before John's assassination, these people saw two men wearing hats. They never saw him before. And after the assassination, they never saw him again. And you have to wonder if John was targeted. And when the way John was feared by the Soviet Union in the 60s, he was also feared by the American government in the 70s. And what happened was in 1971, the Beatles break up April of 1970. Paul McCartney releases his album, his solo album, McCartney, and he has this kind of like mock interview where he talks about, the Beatles breaking up, doesn't know, when and if they might get back together again.
So just to stop you for a minute, we have questions about the how, right? The bullets, I mean, there are issues. The nurse and the doctors apparently all say that he was shot from the front.
From the front.
And Chapman was in the back. And
Correct.
there are witnesses that said he was in the back.
Correct.
There's a cab driver outside. There's other people. So now we have this question. So what's the next step? The next step is, well, before we can give credence to another assassin or a professional assassin, it seems to be the evidence leads to that, you get to, okay, well, if that's true, why?
Right.
And now here's the beginning, or at least some of the beginning, when we're talking about the paranoia of Richard Nixon and others, the beginning of the why.
Right. So in John remains in England for a while, and then in August of 1971, he moves to Bank Street in Greenwich Village. And over there, he meets Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. They were part of, what was it, Chicago 7 or Chicago 8? Forget what it was called.
I think it was 8.
Yeah. So these were radical left-wing anti-war activists. Now, what happens is they get John involved in the Free John Sinclair movement. So John Sinclair was an anti-war activist in Michigan, and he was also in favor of legalization of marijuana. And because of his activities, he was targeted. So he handed over 2 joints to an undercover policewoman and was arrested for that and got 10 years in jail. So, which is quite a stiff sentence for 2 joints. So
even at the time.
So they have this concert in Michigan, December 10th, 1971, and John and Yoko play at it with, they had a whole host of people. Stevie Wonder was there. It was a big to-do. I think there was like 15,000 people in the audience. And John writes this song, John Sinclair. And he talks about, he was given 10 for 2. What else could the judge do? But what's also I find fascinating is he had a line in there about the CIA selling dope and making hay. Now, again, this concert was December 10th, 1971. What is probably the definitive book about the CIA and drug dealing is The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. And that came out in 1972. So I find it weird that John knew about that somehow. Somebody must have told him. And he put that into the lyrics of this song. So what happens is in March of 1972, the Michigan Supreme Court throws out Michigan's marijuana laws and they order John Sinclair to be released. So a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, left and right, felt that that concert was responsible for that decision. And what you have happen is while the Supreme Court of Michigan is mulling things over, Strom Thurmond, a very powerful senator from down south, writes a letter in February of 72 to John Mitchell, who is President Nixon's attorney general. And in that letter, he calls for the deportation of John Lennon. And that's when you have an immediate impact on John's life. It actually happened before that. They were following him they started following him in 1971, and an FBI agent, believe it or not, was sent to that concert to write down everything that John Lennon had to say. You know, if he sang a song, write down the lyrics. If he talked, what did he say? And this is all chronicled in an outstanding documentary called The USA versus John Lennon.
Yeah,
All of this
that's
is
great.
talked about. I mean, and in the documentary, they actually get the FBI guy who was sent to Michigan to write everything down, you know? So they had all of as many of the original players as they could find in this story. So it's a really good documentary.
So to set a little bit of the picture, when John Lennon's pretty much of a recluse, there's no other way to say it. He after he leaves the Beatles, he doesn't really go into he likes to be he's a little bit paranoid. I don't know what else to say. I've told Dom a story how I had witnessed him once, but we won't go into that today. And when John Lennon showed up as a concert, not only did other artists show up because they all want to be on the stage with John Lennon, but people come out and they want to see this god of a person,
Right.
this legend of a singer, an artist, and always has something great to say. And the other part of that little cube there is that in 68 was the first year that from 18 to 21 had the right
72. 72.
72 was the first year? I thought 68.
Yeah, no, 72. That's why the Nixon
Nixon
administration
administration.
became so paranoid.
So I'm sorry. So now in 72, these
Right.
18-year-old to 21-year-old kids who
Right.
were being sent to war 4
Right.
years prior,
Right.
up until 72, I think the draft existed.
Right.
Without a voice, now have a voice. They
Right.
may not be registered.
Right.
And I think that's another thing in this backdrop. Go on.
Yeah, so what happened was, being that they felt victorious with the John Sinclair situation, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin turned their sights on the Nixon administration for that very reason. 18-year-olds would be able to vote. That was John's audience. So they let it out that John was going to do a series of concerts, and he would also appear outside of the Republican National Convention. Now, all of that was a lie. The only thing that John gave consideration to was doing some shows and taking some of the profits from the shows and giving it to people who couldn't afford bail. That's the only thing that he gave consideration to, this large scale thing of following Nixon around and doing concerts and all that. That was made up by Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. However, it scared the hell out of the Nixon administration because, like I said, this was John's demographic. So
Right.
they felt that he would have the ability to register, maybe 1 million kids in that age group. So they really put the screws to John. They were following him, and John talks about this. John says, they didn't make any effort to hide. They wanted us to know that we were being followed. And John got to the point where he told friends of his, if anything ever happens to me or Yoko, it wasn't an accident. So, his phone was being tapped and, he heard it. It was like a crackling noise coming from the basement where the lines were. So he knew all this was going on. And there was definitely a major effort by the Nixon administration to have him deported. And it started, I think, a 3 or 4 year legal battle, and which John eventually won on his birthday, and which is also the birth date of his son Sean,
Right.
October 9th, 1975. And I believe he received his green card in 1976. But in an interesting twist of history, the Nixon administration was scared to death of these they call them left wing radicals and whatnot. So none other than G. Gordon Liddy comes up with this plan called Gemstone, and he had all these diamond and ruby and all this stuff. And one of his plots was to kidnap anti-war demonstrators, which he probably felt, one of them was going to be John Lennon, and bring them to Mexico for something. And this was actually given over to John Mitchell, and John Mitchell just was,
Right. I heard that.
this guy's crazy. But the one thing that they kept out of Gemstone was to bug the Democratic offices,
Right.
which turned into the Watergate.
Well, that's when G. Gordon Liddy and who the other guy was. I brought it to, was it Howard Hunt?
E. Howard Hunt,
A.
Frank
Howard Hunt.
Sturgis,
Yeah, I mean
Bernard Barker.
that to do with the committee to reelect. So
Right.
this was a lot to do with that pre-Watergate plans and whatever else you want to call them. But it's funny in the case, it's not really funny, in the case where they're trying to deport Lennon, they were after memos and things regarding the government and the Department of Immigration or whatever it is, or State Department or whatever it is that were trying to deport him, said routinely that this is something they decided and nobody in the administration
Right.
had anything to do with it. And then at the end of the day, when the subpoenas really get executed and they end up with the documents, the judge sees
Right.
that this is coming from the president of the United States.
Right.
Is behind this, which he was behind a lot. He personally oversaw a lot of these escapades, as you will say,
Yeah.
against his paranoia of the Democratic Party at the time, or suspected Democrats' left side, since he was, listen, he used to, he worked with McCarthy. He was pretty far to the right. So,
Yeah. But it's quite amazing that you have John Lennon within, 3 or 4 year period. He has the leadership of the two most powerful countries in the world are scared to death of him. Think about that. The unchecked power of an entertainer, like that probably hasn't happened before. It certainly hasn't happened since, where somebody has that amount of influence and power that, countries were scared of them. The leadership of countries, at least.
well, the motivation for entertainers used to be money.
Yeah.
Right. And popularity.
Fame.
Except for Lennon, he didn't want fame, and sure as hell he already had money. But what did he want? He wanted peace.
Yep.
He wanted the world different place, and he took that so now he's mobilizing that power and closing the ring on that. And I think that made people, and he couldn't be bought. No one could say, gee, I'll give you $1 million, go over there, go stand over there for a while. He was not interested in any of that stuff.
The protest marches in Washington absolutely impacted the residents of the White House, because in one of them, I think it was in 71, maybe in 72, over 500,000 people marched on Washington, and they were all singing John's song, "Give Peace a Chance." And what the Secret Service did was that they put buses all around the White House because they were scared to death. What happens if this gets violent and they charge the White House? So that's the fear that goes along with the influence of somebody like John Lennon. And that creates problems for people, like John. When you can make a president take notice of you, when you could have the KGB worried about you, that creates problems.
It's funny. My father used to say, I used to repeat it as the most dangerous man in the world is the genuine article. And that really is the true believer. He said that about Malcolm X when he was killed. He goes, the guy really believed what he did. And that's why he was killed. And routinely, the people who are true believers end up getting assassinated. And he was one of them.
Yeah. Yep.
So where do you want to go now? I mean, we obviously did the why or the possible why, or the fear.
So, well,
You
that's
want
the beginning of the why. So
right.
what happens is John gets his green card in 1976, and there's a change in government here. Jimmy Carter is elected, and one of the things that he looks to do is kind of get a handle on the CIA, and several hundred of what they termed the cowboys were let go. These were like the black bag job guys. And so that also coincided with the time where John was basically a house husband. Sean was born in, like I said, John's birthday, October 9th, and John didn't do any work after that. Interestingly, prior to that, though, a lot of people don't know this, but in March of 1974, during his lost weekend time, what happened was he and Yoko had a big blowout in November of 72, and, she kicked him out, and he went to Los Angeles. It was really
Right.
like an 18-month thing, I believe. But in March of 74, Paul McCartney walks in on John Lennon in the studio, and Stevie Wonder's there, Harry Nilsson, about 20 other musicians, and everybody was just, they played. And it's a horrible recording. It's called A Toot and a Snore, because it seems that there was a white substance going around that night. And it's funny, John's on tape saying, Stevie, do you want some? Yeah, it's going around. And Paul played on the drums. And at that time, John was living with cast of characters, Ringo and Keith Moon from The Who. They had a house in L.A. Ringo was out somewhere. And the next day, Paul went to John's house. Ringo wasn't there, but there's photos of John and Paul together. It's actually the last photos of them together. And Ringo came back that night, and he went to the studio, and he saw that his drum kit was changed. And he was like, who touched my drums? And John goes, Paul was here, So there, Paul sued to dissolve the Beatles. I think that started in December of 70. And initially it was, they were
Right.
rough together, but by 74 they were fine. And there's actually 1976, an interesting thing happened. Paul again walks in on John at the Dakota this time, and he spends all day with him. And at night, they're watching Saturday Night Live. And that happened to be the night where Lorne
George.
Michaels comes out with this gigantic check and it's $1,000 for the Beatles to get back together. Now, here's John Lennon and Paul McCartney. They're looking at this, and they look at each other. Should we go? But, it was late, and they were tired, so they didn't go. So, kind of funny.
And it was in New York. They were in L.A.
15, yeah. No, they were here. They were here. Yeah,
So-
John was in the Dakota by that time.
Isn't that what? And wasn't George there? Wasn't George playing that night with Paul Simon?
2 or 3 weeks later, George came in.
That's when they did the shtick about
him wanting to check
for 4, not for 1.
Yeah. It was great. But it almost happened, It almost happened. So John is basically from 1975 to 1980, pretty much stationed in the Dakotas, taking care of Sean. Yoko is doing a lot of the business. They're buying properties, they're buying cows. They were big into buying cows. Then what happens is Paul does an album. I think it was his second solo album called McCartney 2. John said he couldn't get it out of his head. There was a song coming up, I believe. Yeah. And he just couldn't get it out of his head. And what happened was that motivated him to write again. And he took this sailboat, went down to Bermuda, hit really, really rough weather. John actually took the helm and they landed the boat safely. Within a couple of weeks, he wrote all the songs of what became Double Fantasy. So now, prior to that, we have certain going on that I think created part of the the why, some of the politics involved. In 1979, you have the rise of communism in Central America. Nicaragua was taken over by the Sandinistas.
Right.
Later on, that event leads to what became known as the Iran-Contra scandal. In 1979, you had this committee created called the Committee on the Present Danger. And that was around in the 50s, it was around in the 70s, the 2000s, and 2019. There's been 4 iterations of it. But the one in the 70s was formed right after Jimmy Carter was elected. It was formed on November 11th, 1976. And 33 people who wound up being officials in the Reagan administration were part of that committee, including Director of Central Intelligence William Casey, National Security Advisor Richard Allen, the Ambassador to the UN Jeane Kirkpatrick, Secretary of the Navy John Lehman, Secretary of State George Shultz, Assistant Secretary of Defense Richard Pearl. And Reagan himself was a member in 1979. And what they did was they studied the strength of the USSR compared to our strength, specifically in the area of Europe. And they were very concerned about the introduction of the Russian nuclear missile, the SS. They were also very concerned and felt that we could not counter a Soviet conventional thrust into Western Europe, that they had just too many tanks, too many men, and we couldn't deal with it. So their counter move, which they proposed, was to introduce short-range and medium-range nuclear missiles into Europe, which did happen in 1983, I believe. Have these notes here. We introduced Pershing missiles and nuclear-tipped cruise missiles into West Germany, United Kingdom, and Italy. So now, in 1980, November 1980, Ronald Reagan crushes Jimmy Carter in the election, and all of these people are about to take office, and they have these issues that they want to deal with. I'm sure that there's a lot of people left over from the Nixon administration that were concerned about John Lennon back in 72. And my guess is, the why.
Right.
I think that they did not want to deal with a world where John Lennon could protest what they were doing by putting 1 million people in the street. And clearly, it's been demonstrated that he had that ability. He had it on his own, and there's some evidence to suggest that the Beatles might have gotten back together again in the early 80s. What happened was we have 2 legal documents that suggest that. One is, I believe it was in January of 1979, Paul McCartney signed a 10-year contract with CBS.
Right.
And in that contract, there's a clause that says he could get out of the contract if he records with John Lennon, George Harrison, and Richard Starkey, which is actually Ringo Starr's real name. Then you have another legal document. What happened was in the latter 1970s, there was a thing in New York called Beatlemania, which was a Broadway show.
I remember it.
Yeah. And
it was good.
It was great. I didn't see that. I saw it like later on.
It had all phases. It went through all phases of the Beatles.
Right. What they basically did was they broke down the Beatles' career into 3 phases, and then they would dress accordingly to each phase and play the songs for those phases. So this became a huge hit. And what happened was it became such a big hit that the real Beatles sued the producers of Beatlemania in New York State Court. I don't recall the year, if it was 79. For sure, it was going on in 1980 because around 10 days before his assassination, John Lennon had to submit a written deposition as to why this is, could damage the real Beatles, this Broadway show. And what he said in his written deposition was that the Beatles were going to embark on telling their own story. The project was tentatively titled The Long and Winding Road, and it was going to culminate with a live concert somewheres, in the mid-'80s.
I remember that now.
What John is clearly describing what became the anthology, 15 years later. But that, and what's interesting is that lawsuit was concluded, I believe, in 1986. This was not a cheap lawsuit. The real Beatles won, and they were given a judgment of $11 million. So we're not talking little, money here. John's deposition was never challenged by the attorneys for the producers of Beatlemania. So my guess is they didn't challenge it because they knew it was true. So you also have, in May of 1979, 3 of the Beatles were invited to Eric Clapton's wedding, to Pattie Boyd.
Right.
For some reason, John didn't get an invitation. He said he would have been there if he was invited, but he wasn't. So Paul, George, and Ringo were there, and they played together, and they actually played Sgt. Pepper, and they got along very well. What was supposed to happen was, in April of 1981, all 4 Beatles had committed to helping Ringo in studio with his album. So they might not have been in the studio all 4 together, but they were going to be in the studio. So this was a first for that. So in the past, John had written songs for Ringo, Paul wrote songs, George played with Ringo, but all 4 weren't in the studio. Paul and John wrote their songs and sent it to him.
I remember on one of the albums, John Lennon was named Ziggy Fanucci.
Yeah. He did that a lot in the 70s. I think he was Winston O' Boogie in Elton John's version of Lucy in the Sky.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that had, obviously John not been killed, had things gone well with Ringo's album, we probably would have seen a Beatles album, 1982, 1983. I think that would have happened because before, they had talked about, John and Paul talked about for several years getting together and writing again. As a matter of fact, before John got back with Yoko, Paul had invited him to New Orleans to write with him on what became Venus and Mars. And John was going to go. And May Pang, who was John's girlfriend during that time, absolutely confirms that. And fairly recently, a postcard was found. And I forget who John sent it to, but he said, I'll be going to New Orleans to visit the Max, Also, Jack Douglas, who was a producer for Double Fantasy, he talks about how John talked to him about writing with Paul again. So I think that absolutely would have happened. Would it, how long they might have done something, who knows? But I think that when you look at the power and influence of John Lennon, that's bad enough. If you have the Beatles together in 1982 and they're in Europe talking about, don't put in these Euro missiles, you got a political problem on your hands.
I agree. Thank you. I think there's a lot of fear about people who are that powerful.
And the other thing I wish to add,
no matter who they are,
without a doubt,
but I think people that are uncontrollable,
right,
and cannot be bought by any sense or any way, shape, or form, are really scare the people that live by power and money.
The other thing that was happening in 1980, which contributes to John's ability now to communicate instantaneously with millions of people, is America was being wired for cable TV, and you
Right.
had the introduction of CNN. MTV started in August of 1981. So they filmed in Fort Lee, New Jersey. So that's only like, half hour or so ride from Manhattan. If John was alive, don't you think that he would have had a gig whatever he wanted on MTV? And
Absolutely.
you'd be able to talk to millions of people all at once. And of course the plan uh in the mid 80s, everything went worldwide. So, before that, kids today might not grasp this, but the only way to be on national TV was if they put you on the national news. Everything else
Right.
was local. So, even a John Lennon, if he was at a somewhere in 1971, well, maybe the local place would have talked about it, but Walter Cronkite's not going to talk about it.
Right. Well, he was on Mike Douglas with
Right,
Yoko, right?
right,
And
for a
and
week. Yeah.
the guest host, because he had guest hosts all the time, and many other famous people were there. But I remember watching the John Lennon one, and that's not national. We look at it national because it was filmed in New York and whatever. But at that time, in those early years, even later, I mean, things weren't all West Coast when it comes to television. Television was
Mhm.
in New York for a long period of time. Now that show was syndicated, so it was shown in other places. But there are many, many people that never saw that show. I mean,
Right.
was it was great. I don't remember him singing. I don't think he did.
I
I
think he
think
did with didn't he do something with Chuck Berry?
he may have. I don't recall because that could have been the same time as Rock and Roll album came out.
Yeah,
But I
yeah.
remember having conversations, long conversations with people. So Mike Douglas let him speak, and he really spoke his mind.
Yeah,
About
no, he brought out, forget if it was Huey Newton or the other guy from the Black Panthers. He brought out
right,
Jerry Rubin. There's I forget the name of the documentary, but a documentary, was it John and Yoko 1-to-1, something like that? Came
yeah.
out last year, which chronicles that week where they were the, hosts of the Mike Douglas show.
I was taken back. I flipped it on because my mother watched it every day. So it
Yeah,
was on Monday to Friday at like 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock, or something.
right,
And I'd
right.
come over from school. She flips it on. There's John Lennon, Yoko Ono on. I'm like, we didn't see them in that era. You rarely heard from them. I
Right.
mean, other than, on the news, as you say, when they did a sleep in or bed in or whatever the heck they called it.
Yeah, that was even, like, in '69 up in
Right.
Toronto, so,
So, right.
yeah,
So
but,
you didn't see anything for a long period of time. He was like a hermit.
probably the biggest thing that he did, uh, where people watched was, he was on the Grammys, in, I believe, 1974 or '75, um, and, it's interesting because, after the Grammys, he had Garfunkel at his house, and he was talking about, you know, Paul had invited, John to go to New Orleans, like I said before. He goes, "What do you think?" And Art goes, "Yeah." He goes, "Go for it," you know? But, of course, it never happened.
Right.
Um, but I think that, what we've established is reasons why powerful entities would not want to see John Lennon around for the 1980s. And when you have, like I said, when this book came out, up until the time this book came out, I kind of thought that Mark David Chapman was an MK Ultra guy, but that he actually did the shooting. This book has changed my mind to it. And what is also very interesting is that Mark David Chapman was visited by two very, very prominent hypnotherapists. And one was named Bernard Diamond, who also worked with another probable MK Ultra assassin named Sirhan, who is in jail for killing Robert Kennedy. And the other one is Milton Klein, who, for some reason, in 1979 went on TV and admitted that he was a consultant to the CIA. and that he worked on the MK Ultra program. So I find that a little weird.
Mm. So that
And
seems right.
what David Whelan speculated, I think it's on his Substack, that they wanted to go in to check on his programming because something happened that wasn't supposed to happen. David speculates that Chapman was probably supposed to flee and go to a place where he was going to meet his prearranged demise. But that didn't happen. Like I said, he sat down and started reading The Catcher in the Rye. So he thinks that, he might have been reprogrammed, and that's when we get kicked in the whole, he had to kill John Lennon, this hypnotic trance type stuff that he was spewing in the 80s.
So if Lennon's killed from the front, right, that means there's another shooter. We can agree that Lennon's assassin didn't have the ability or training to do, well, obviously to shoot him from the front because he was in the back, but to as you mentioned earlier in the beginning, to do a close round grouping of shots is incredibly difficult, especially under the pressure. Here's a guy that's never really done those kind of things. He's not a warrior. He never didn't go and do assassinations for military or kill people for the military. So this is a new thing for him, and obviously going to the range and shooting a real person is remarkably different. And so that means that someone else did. And that leaves the question is, who did it?
That, you know, it seems that David Whelan is working on a second book, and hopefully he comes up with some possibilities. Um, you know, I don't have any ideas as to who who could have done it, who would have done it. Um, I just think it was a government operation, but
Right. Who, where, what, and
you
why. I
know,
mean, you
the
look
other
at the
thing is,
assassination of RFK, they didn't want him to go forward because he
yeah,
was going to challenge the powers that be, the
yeah.
Nixon right wing armada, CIA armada of thought process. So you would say that it's the same kind of group inside the CIA or splintered from the CIA that carry out these kinds of missions.
Yeah, and the who the person actually was, I don't think is as big of a deal as the why,
I agree.
And I think today we see, you know, a lot of control for celebrities. They get up there and they have a certain line that they have to take, and if they don't take that line, then they're attacked. So I think that directly because of John Lennon and the fear that he created amongst people in high positions, to let today's celebrity have been largely neutered. I mean, there's nobody close to John Lennon, but I think that a lot of it they probably were told, listen, if you want to be like John, to get along, you go along, right? In this institution, to get along, you go along. So,
Well, it's funny. It seems that, recent assassination attempts, you saw two. And matter of fact, today's the day where one of the Trump assassins got life in prison. And it seems to be, from what we've seen about these assassinations in more recent times, it's not really right or left we're talking about.
mhm.
We're talking about an alternative agenda that is threatened, whether it's money, whether it's power, whether it's control, that there's some kind of agenda out there. And I don't want to speculate that, you know, Eisenhower called it the, military industrial
Military industrial
complex.
complex.
But I think that's a catchword. I'm not sure it's the military industrial complex, but it's certainly some similar type group of people that are in power, whether it's financially, whether it's business wise, where they control lots of people, lots of jobs, and have effect on governments and policy all over the world.
George Carlin says a big club and you ain't in it.
I think that's true. I obviously don't want to, in the grand scheme of things, I could care less, but I do care that people are assassinated for a political end.
Yes. Yeah, it's a tragedy. I mean, what was taken from the world, by these assassinations, we never uh would be able to determine how things would have changed. It's a
Yes,
sad, sad thing.
I mean, what if you don't know if Lennon would really do something like that? Really, though he was organizing a tour to register voters all over the United States, right? And that he was looking to register young people, and it wasn't Republican or Democrat, but certainly his ideology was further left than the
Yeah.
present administration or most any administration. So, and certainly, if you want to talk about the military industrial complex in the war in Vietnam, he was certainly against that and against
Yeah.
peace and against anything. So, if that was the case, certainly he had put himself in harm's way of that.
Without a doubt. We'll never know how it could have turned out.
Yeah, we know that we would have liked to see him write songs with Paul again and
Yeah.
them sung by the boys, and we never will. So I don't know if that's the place you want to leave it, or is there something else you wanted to cover?
No, that's a pretty good place.
I think so.
But just
So
like I said, plug for David Whelan. He did yeoman's work on this subject, and his book is Mind Games: The Assassination of John Lennon. And check out his Substack and like and subscribe to this channel as well.
yes, History's Agenda. This is since we changed the name after the first year, this is one of the more important episodes that we're starting to talk about the Assassination Game. We're still going to come back to RFK a little. We did talk about JFK at the end of the year. Last year, did a little roundtable discussion. That's out there listening. There's also Dom and I doing something about the Reagan assassination. There's a book out there being written as we speak or published as we speak by Roger Stone, who was in many administrations, that may add the president's name to these kinds of assassinations. We shall see what those facts yield when they're written. But for now, I thank Dom. Thank you very much. I think you
Thank
did an
you.
amazing job today. You covered it all. We went through it. John Lennon is missed, and his music lives on forever. His son is without a father. His wife is without a husband, and I think the world saw his power by the outpouring of people. I remember every person I ran into that day when I worked. I was a salesman in a men's clothing department in A&S in Paramus Park, New Jersey, that next day, and I hadn't slept one wink because I was up listening to WNEW. So it was a day that really threw me off. I wanted more than anything to just quit my job and go in the city and stand out the Dakota with everybody else, but it wasn't meant to be.
Yeah.
So, having said that, please like and subscribe to our channel, History's Agenda, and we look forward to having Dom again. And I love your comments and we love your support. And thank you very much.